Okay, I believe everyone's here. We can start the meeting in a few minutes whenever you're ready, Professor.
Yeah, I'm ready whenever you folks are ready.
Thank you very much for meeting. We'd like to introduce you for a brief second. Professor Mearsheimer is the Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor at the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago. He is also an international theorist. He is known for being a proponent of offensive realism, and he has taught at the University of Chicago, I think, since 1994. He is known for co-authoring the famous book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, co-authoring with Professor Stephen Wall, which was a groundbreaking book in addressing a topic that very few academics were, let's say, brave enough to address and to face the criticism. So, Professor Mearsheimer, thank you very much for coming today. We would like to give you the floor for a few brief minutes for you to lay out the groundwork of your book and what the premises are and what the current situation in Israel is, perhaps.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'll do is I'll spend about 10 to 15 minutes at the very most, just sort of laying out the basic argument in the book and describing the lobby and how it works. And then we can go into Q&A. And of course, I'm willing to talk about, the Gaza war, the recent Iran-Israel conflict, maybe I should say the ongoing Israel-Iran conflict, and, almost any other subject that the students want to talk about. But let me say a few words about the lobby. Starting with the question of what exactly is the lobby. The lobby, Steve and I argue, is a loose group of individuals and organizations like AIPAC, which I'm sure almost everybody has heard of, that works together to push U.S. foreign policy in what they believe is a pro-Israel direction. It's very important to understand that it is not a Jewish lobby. This is not to deny for 1 second that Jews are the core of the lobby, but not all Jews are supporters of the lobby's policy preferences. Not all Jews care much about Israel. And there are a substantial number of Jews who are opposed to Israeli policy and opposed to the policies that the lobby pushes. And as I like to tell people, when Steve and I wrote the book, and before that the article, which was extremely controversial, virtually all of our defenders were Jewish. So very important to understand it's not a Jewish lobby. I might add to that a key component of the Israel lobby are the Christian Zionists. And the Christian Zionists are obviously not Jewish. They're Christian evangelicals. And sometimes supporters of Israel will argue that the Christian Zionists are stronger supporters of Israel than American Jews are. So again, this is a lobby that's comprised of Jews and Christian Zionists and some others as well, but it's not a Jewish lobby. Second point I would make is it's not a foreign lobby. In the United States, we have what's called the Saudi lobby, but the Saudi lobby is a foreign lobby. It's the Saudi government trying to influence American policy and hiring different organizations or firms in Washington, D.C. to help them sell policies that the Saudi government likes. The Israel lobby is made up of Americans. It's made up of Americans who work on behalf of Israel. And again, what they try to do is push U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. Finally, it's important to understand that it's not illegal what the lobby does. It's not immoral. It's not unethical. It's just part of the warp and woof of American politics. It's very important to understand that the American political system is set up in ways that allow interest groups to have an enormous amount of influence. So we have in the United States a lot of powerful interest groups or lobbies that wield great influence in the policymaking process. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the National Rifle Association. It's almost impossible to get meaningful gun control in the United States because of the power of the National Rifle Association. On the foreign policy front, we have the Cuban lobby, which is mainly located in Florida. And the Cuban lobby is very powerful in terms of influencing US policy on Cuba. So it's important to understand that the Israel lobby is one of many lobbies. I would argue it is the most powerful lobby in the United States by far. It is an extremely powerful lobby for sure, but lobbies are part of the political system here in the United States. And again, what the Israel lobby is doing is not illegal or unethical or immoral. You can dislike the policies that it pushes, which I do, and Steve does, but again, it's perfectly legal. Now, the question is, what is its goal? And it's very important to understand that the lobby's goal is to provide unconditional support for Israel. I want to underline those words, unconditional support. And basically what this means is that no matter what Israel does or wants to do, the lobby pushes extremely hard to get the United States to support Israel, again, unconditionally. And as I said before, it is wildly successful. There's just no question about that. Everybody understands just how powerful the lobby is. Now, many people will argue, if they are supporters of Israel, that the reason the United States supports Israel is because it is in America's strategic interest, number one, and number two, it is the morally correct thing to do. And the argument that Steve and I make is that that is not true, that by and large, Israel is not a strategic asset. It is on occasion, but it is by and large not a strategic asset. And the argument that we should support Israel unequivocally for moral reasons is simply an argument you cannot make. And our argument is that the reason that we support Israel unconditionally is not for strategic logic, not for moral logic, but because of the power of the lobby. Now, a few words about how the lobby operates. The lobby works in two different ways. One is that it goes to great lengths to try to influence or control the discourse in the United States about Israel. In other words, the lobby does not like the idea of John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt writing an article or a book that's critical of the lobby, critical of Israel, and critical of the US-Israeli relationship. So the lobby went to great lengths to minimize the influence that our argument had. The lobby goes to great lengths to make sure that critics of Israel do not appear in the mainstream media. Again, the name of the game here is to control the discourse about Israel and the US-Israeli relationship as much as possible. So that's the first way that the lobby wields its great influence. The second way is that it puts direct pressure on policymakers to pursue policies that are pro-Israel, or what the lobby thinks are pro-Israel. And if you are a congressperson, you're in Congress, either in the Senate or the House of Representatives, or if you're in the White House, you're the President of the United States, you know very well that if you criticize Israel or you pursue a policy against Israel that the lobby does not like, you will pay a significant price. So it is no accident that here in the United States, there is what I would call knee-jerk support for Israel on Capitol Hill in Congress and in the executive branch, or to put it differently, in the White House. The relationship between the United States and Israel has no parallel in history. You want to understand, there is not a single case in the historical record where one country supported another country unconditionally. This is a truly amazing relationship. It is remarkable how much influence Israel has in the United States through the Israel lobby. It's a special relationship for sure. Now, let me just say a few words about Gaza, because I think that what you see happening in Gaza today is an excellent example of the lobby at work. There is no question that Israel is an apartheid state. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which are three of the most important human rights groups in the world. And indeed, B'Tselem is an Israeli human rights group. These three human rights groups have all produced lengthy reports that lay out in great detail why Israel is an apartheid state. You all understand that it's politically incorrect to say that Israel is an apartheid state in the United States, but it is an apartheid state. And at the moment, Israel is executing a genocidal strategy in Gaza. So here we have a case where you have an apartheid state that is executing a genocidal policy. It is not in the American national interest to support Israel's behavior in Gaza. It makes no strategic sense, and it clearly makes no moral or ethical sense, not at all. Nevertheless, if you look at what the United States is doing regarding Israeli behavior in Gaza, we are supporting and defending Israel at almost every turn. This is truly remarkable. This is truly remarkable. The fact that the United States of America, a liberal democracy that prides itself on ethical behavior, that talks all the time about the importance of human rights and doing the morally correct thing, is supporting a genocide in Gaza. So you want to ask yourself, why is this the case? Why is it that Congress, almost to a person, is in favor of supporting Israel, no matter what, in Gaza? Why is the Biden administration protecting Israel diplomatically in the UN Security Council and in other places? Why is the United States providing Israel with substantial military aid while it is prosecuting a genocide? It's not because it's in our strategic interest, and it's not certainly because it's in our moral interest, or it's the ethically or morally correct thing to do. It's anything but that. The reason that the United States is supporting Israel so completely with regard to the Gaza conflict is in large part because of the lobby and the fear that Congress people and the president have of crossing Israel over Gaza. With that, I'll stop and we can go to Q&A, and I'll be happy to answer all the questions that you folks have.
Thank you very much, Professor. I have two interrelated questions, actually. One is much simpler, I would guess, so where exactly does the Israel lobby derive this power from? Is it the ability to control votes? Is it the ability to control campaign funding? If not, what is it? And second, related to that, your book has opened up this discussion of the Israel lobby and its influence on US foreign policy to a degree that was not seen in US rhetoric, US public discourse at all. And despite that, and despite the fact that it seems a majority of Biden supporters, Biden voters, support the cutting of military aid to Israel to stop its military incursions in Gaza. And despite this, it seems the US keeps supporting Israel in whatever it does. What exactly has been reason for that? Why hasn't the course changed for US support?
Okay, I'll take your questions in reverse order. I think there's no doubt, as you were saying, that the article and the book that Steve and I wrote back in 2006, 2007, the article was in 2006, the book was in 2007, has played a key role in opening up the discourse on the lobby, on the US-Israeli relationship, and even on Israeli policy. I think there's no question about that. But we have had, I think it's fair to say, zero influence on policy. And you, in effect, were saying that, and it's correct. We have not had an influence on policy. And I'll talk more about why that's the case in a minute. But you also note, quite correctly, that if you look at public opinion in the United States, that what you see is that there is great dissatisfaction with Israel. It's really quite remarkable. Let me just give you one fact that highlights this. 50%, that's 50% of the people who voted for Biden in 2020 believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. That's a remarkable figure. And if you look at how young people, and this includes young Jews, think about what Israel's doing, there is great dissatisfaction. So there is a lot of unhappiness in the body politic. But the key point is that among the policymakers, among the foreign policy elite, there has been no real change in their behavior. Who knows what they're thinking behind closed doors? But in terms of the actual policy, in terms of the behavior of the policymakers, there's been no change. So moving forward, one of the really big questions is whether or not all of that discontent down below, especially in the Democratic Party, will cause Democratic policymakers to change their behavior. Just to elaborate on this point, because it's such an important one, Joe Biden is probably going to lose in the fall. And I'm not saying that's for certain, but he's behind in the polls, and there are a good number of smart people I know who think he's going to lose. And there is reason to think that this issue, his support for Israel's behavior in Gaza, will play a key role if he loses, right? It's really quite remarkable. So one could argue that if that happens moving forward, at least in the Democratic Party, right, the lobby will have much less influence and policy will change. But going back to your original point, there has been no change in policy up to now. Now, your question, this sort of ties in with the first question. You know, you asked me, where does the lobby's power derive from? And you want to remember, I said the lobby goes to great lengths to try to control the discourse, number one. And number two, it goes to great lengths to try to influence policymakers. And it's that second strand where the lobby has its great influence, right? In other words, if you go back to the discourse involves the public. And there, the lobby is having great difficulty. It's not able to control the discourse like it once did, which feeds into your point that the public is beginning to turn on Israel, right? Nevertheless, the lobby continues to have great influence at the elite level among the policy makers. Now, what is the source of that influence? When you talk about policymakers, the key thing you want to understand is to get elected in the United States of America to a higher political office, you need lots of money. You need campaign contributions. And the lobby not only provides money, campaign contributions to people who support Israel unconditionally, it also will target politicians or policymakers who oppose Israel. And it will funnel money to their rivals in a political campaign. So if you are a US congressman, you understand that if you vote against Israel, you vote against the policies that the lobby is pushing, the lobby will turn to your opponent in the next election and go to great lengths to help you get defeated. And you, of course, as a politician, want to remain in office. So therefore, you will support the lobby. And again, this goes back to Joe Biden. You want to think about the difficult situation that Joe Biden is in. If Joe Biden supports the Palestinians and opposes Israel's policy in Gaza, the lobby will go after him and make him pay a significant price in the November election. If, on the other hand, Biden continues to act in a pro-Israel way in Gaza, Arab Americans, progressives, and younger voters will punish him at the voting booth in November. So Biden, in a very important way, is in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And what I believe he is likely to do over time is side with Israel, because the power of the lobby is so great. But that remains to be seen. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your two excellent questions.
Thank you. So going back to the topic of elections, do you foresee any change in US policy towards Israel with the possible election of Donald Trump as president? Or do you think the influence of the Israel lobby will remain as it was on US foreign policy?
I don't think it matters whether Trump is elected or Biden is. I should say it doesn't matter whether either one of them are reelected, because Trump has been president and Biden is president. Whoever wins, I don't think there will be any substantial change. You want to remember, in his 4 years in office, Trump was very pro-Israel. He fostered the Abraham Accords. He allowed the Israelis to build settlements. He hardly protested at all. He moved the capital to Jerusalem, or excuse me, he moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. And he was very pro-Israel, and there's no reason to think that he will change. I would note to you, by the way, that the Republican Party is more pro-Israel than the Democratic Party is, and Trump, of course, is a Republican.
Right. So, I mean, you discussed in your various experiences how much of an influence the Israel lobby has on U.S. foreign policy. But um, in the long term, even, do you foresee a route out of this influence that is the Israel lobby has on U.S. foreign policy? How can it be reduced? Can it be reduced? Is there a way to perhaps decrease the level of influence they have over U.S. foreign policy to those of other lobbies? Is there a route for a route to salvation, so to say?
Well, I mean, one question one might ask is whether there's a possibility of, let's call it an Arab lobby or a pro-Palestinian lobby. I don't know what you would call it. I don't think you'll ever get a pro-Palestinian, let's call it a pro-Palestinian. I don't think you'll ever get a pro-Palestinian lobby that is in the same league as the Israel lobby. But what's really happened here is that you have large numbers of people who speak out on behalf of the Palestinians and have a huge voice in the media. Maybe not the mainstream media, but in social media for sure. So there is now an alternative discourse for sure. And I would argue that people like me are part of that alternative discourse. There are all sorts of people who are critical of Israel, critical of the lobby, and critical of the US-Israeli relationship. And I might add here that one of the arguments that Steve and I made, and we still make it, is that we believe that the lobby is pursuing policies that are not good for Israel. In other words, we think the lobby is bad for the United States and bad for Israel. To be more specific, the United States has pushed for a two-state solution for many years, going back to President Jimmy Carter, who was president between 1977 and 1981. That's a long time ago. I would imagine that virtually nobody in this audience, except for me, was born when Jimmy Carter was president. But Jimmy Carter was pushing a two-state solution. And I believe, and Steve believes, that a two-state solution would have not only been good for Israel, it would have been good for the United States. I believe we would not have the Gaza war had there been a two-state solution. The principal obstacle to a two-state solution was Israel working hand in hand with the lobby to thwart every president who pushed a two-state solution. So our argument is the lobby is not only not good for the United States, it's not good for Israel. And I think a lot of American Jews and a lot of supporters of Israel are coming to recognize that the road that the Israelis are now on is, if the Israelis are not careful, the road to destruction. This is not a smart way to execute foreign policy. So what I'm saying to you is more and more people are coming to understand what is going on with regard to Israel and the Palestinians, and with regard to Israel and countries like Iran as well. And the end result is the discourse is changing. And I believe that with the passage of time, as the discourse changes and it becomes clearer and clearer that what Israel is doing is not in our strategic interest, and it is not the morally correct thing to do to support Israel, that the policy will slowly begin to change. But it's going to take time. It's not going to happen right away. Again, because the lobby is a remarkably formidable set of individuals and institutions who work in very effective ways to influence policy.
Right. Thank you for your response. So perhaps going back to the current situation in Israel. So Iran actually retaliated to the Israeli attack on the embassy to the embassies in Damascus with drone strikes yesterday, as I'm sure you followed. And although Iranian officials are now saying that the conflict is over now, as far as they're concerned, the public, it seems, and the Israeli officials are planning somewhat of a counteroffensive, counterattack. And it seems that US officials are encouraging restraint. To what degree that will be influential is questionable, but do you foresee an escalation in conflicts in terms of Israeli and Iranian relations? And do you believe that the neighboring powers, as well as the US, might be drawn into this as possible escalation, if there will be one?
A lot of questions there. Let me make a number of points. First of all, neighbors have already been drawn in. Jordan participated in the Israeli defense effort against the Iranian attack. In fact, as best I can tell, the UK, Britain, the United States, Jordan, and Israel all worked together to deal with the Iranian missile attack. Just a quick point, it was not only drones. It's very important to understand that it was drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. And there's even some talk that some of those ballistic missiles were hypersonic missiles, which are almost impossible to shoot down. My sense is that the Israelis shot down almost all the drones and all the cruise missiles, but that a number of the ballistic missiles got through and that they did damage. How much damage is hard to say, but they damaged some important military sites. You just want to understand that those ballistic missiles are a real problem for the Israelis and for the Americans as well in terms of shooting them down. Now, you ask about the United States and its position with regard to this whole crisis / conflict. First of all, it was initiated by the Israelis. The Israelis started this when they bombed the Iranian consulate or the Iranian embassy in Damascus. This is a violation of international law, and it was unprovoked. So the Israelis started it, and what happened with the Iranians on Saturday night is they retaliated. Now, it is very important to emphasize that the Americans did not want a war with Iran. The Americans have no interest in seeing the war escalate beyond Gaza. And the Iranians did not want a war with the United States or with Israel. So again, both the United States and Iran did not want a war. Unsurprisingly, it appears that the Israelis did not warn us that they were attacking the embassy in Damascus. And we have told them to never do that again without giving us a warning. And of course, the reason they didn't warn us was because we would have told them, don't do it. Because as I said to you, the last thing that we need at this point in time is a wider war in the greater Middle East. Now, what's going on here is that the Israelis were trying to drag us into a war with Iran. So it is clear that the Iranians and the Americans coordinated the Iranian attack that took place on Saturday night. That the Americans worked with the Iranians to make sure that everything was done in a limited way so that this would not escalate into a larger war. The Iranians, of course, have made it clear that as far as they're concerned, this is the final step. They don't want any more war either, which is consistent with what I said. The problem here is that the Israelis might retaliate. And as you surely recognize, as I'm sure everybody on the call recognizes, that if the Israelis attack Iran in retaliation for what happened Saturday night, then the Iranians will retaliate against the Israelis. And then probably the Israelis will retaliate again. And where this all ends, who knows? But this is the last thing the United States wants. It's the last thing Iran wants. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you think the Israelis can tell themselves a story where further escalation leaves them better off? I think the answer is no. It's hard for me to see where the Israelis gain from retaliating against Iran. Because again, the Iranians will retaliate. And you want to understand, the United States has said publicly that it will not support Israel if it attacks Iran in retaliation for Saturday night. So the Iranians and the Americans don't want a war. And we have made it clear to the Israelis, we will not support them if they attack Iran. And I think that should be enough to keep the Israelis from retaliating directly against Iran. That's not to say they won't attack another embassy. Who knows for sure? But I think that the Israelis will not directly attack Iran. And I think, and I certainly hope, that we will escape further retaliation.
Thank you, Professor. So now moving on to another topic, perhaps. We have a question regarding the European Union and their stance on the issue. So the question is as follows. How do you perceive von der Leyen's and Scholz's support for Israel? And for such support of human rights, the Commission, can defending an act of genocide be the price of the Second World War? Does the lobbying power of Israel exist enough to such a degree in the European Union to continue this stance that they have towards Israel right now?
I mean, I find the European position on Gaza, in particular on the genocide in Gaza, stunning and categorically depressing. And it shows the influence of Israel and the various European versions of the Israel lobby on European states. I think what is most remarkable, I mean, it's truly remarkable, is Germany's position on the genocide. As a country that committed the first genocide of the 20th century in Southwest Africa, and the most famous genocide of the 20th century, which of course is the Holocaust, it is hard to believe, almost impossible to believe, that the Germans are staunchly defending Israeli behavior, Israel's genocidal behavior in Gaza. But they are. And I don't know what to say beyond that. With regard to the EU more generally, I think Joseph Borrell and some of the EU policymakers have begun to speak up a little bit, but not very much. I think their behavior, on balance, is disgraceful. I think somewhere down the road, when the dust settles and this is all over with, and people take stock of what happened, The behavior of European policymakers and American policymakers is going to be seen in the most negative of lights. I think that the elites, the transatlantic elites, so to speak, have failed to do the right thing in this case. And it will be a black mark on their records moving forward.
Thank you, Professor. So another question is going back to the global public image of the United States. So we talked about how the image of the United States in the eyes of the global public, perhaps because of its actions in Israel, or because of their support, has diminished. Do you think there is a way for the United States to gain this public standing back? And if so, what could that be? Like what course of action would lead to a course correction in terms of gaining their image back?
Well, one thing the United States could do, but it's not going to do, is a 180-degree turn and go to great lengths to put pressure on Israel to shut the genocide down. That would go a long way toward restoring America's reputation. But that's not going to happen. So I think the only hope here is the passage of time. When I was young, my mother used to say, time heals all wounds. And I would imagine that with the passage of time, many people around the world will forget, in large part, America's support for Israel, for Israel's genocidal policies in Gaza. But it'll take a long time. And I believe actually in the case of Israel, it will never go away. This will be a permanent stain on Israel's reputation. And but I think in the American case, time will help. But the best solution, of course, would be if we changed our policy. And by the way, it would be the best policy for Israel if we could shut this down. Because you want to understand that Israel is not on its way to victory in Gaza. Israel is going to lose in Gaza. And you're beginning to see this argument made clearly, unequivocally, in the Israeli media. Israelis understand they're not going to win. So here you have a situation where they're not only going to fail to achieve their policy objectives, but they're going to be guilty of a genocide. It would make much more sense if the United States now did a 180-degree turn, put huge pressure on the Israelis to stop this horror and come up with some sort of viable policy for moving forward. But again, we're paralyzed. And you want to understand that we're principally paralyzed because of the lobby. We just have remarkably little flexibility to maneuver on the Israel issue. And again, as I've said on numerous occasions here, that's not to our advantage and it's not to Israel's advantage.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, please, but in your previous appearances, I recall that you stated there's a great domestic support within Israel for its policies, both in Gaza as well as the hawkish stance they display towards Iran. And that Benjamin Netanyahu is not necessarily a problem because in terms of the Israeli political context, he's not necessarily a radical. He's moderate in the Israeli political spectrum in terms of the hawkish approach they display. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, I agree with the thrust of what you said. I'm just a little reluctant to use the word moderate to describe Benjamin Netanyahu, but I understand what you were getting at. And of course, you're correct. Yeah, I mean, a lot of Israel's supporters in the United States want to make the argument that Benjamin Netanyahu is the bad guy. And if we get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, all will be well, or will go a long way towards fixing the problem. This is delusional, right? Within his cabinet, to use your rhetoric, Netanyahu is a moderate. He has people to his right. But even the more mainstream figures in Netanyahu's war cabinet, people like Benny Gantz, are no doves when it comes to the Palestinians, no doves when it comes to the genocide. If you look at his Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, he's every bit as hawkish as Netanyahu is. So getting rid of Netanyahu is not going to solve the problem. And what's going on here is that Israel is a remarkably right-wing country that has really horrible attitudes about the Palestinians. There's a poll that came out earlier this year that said that 68%, this is a poll by a reputable institution in Israel that showed that 68% of Israelis are in favor of cutting off all food, water, and medical aid into Gaza. You're basically talking about killing everybody in Gaza if you cut off all food, water, and medical assistance for any appreciable period of time. It's just hard to believe that 68% of the population was in favor of doing that. Now you ask yourself, why is that the case? And I actually have a very simple answer to that. If you have an apartheid state and you have one population or one part of that population in that apartheid state that is interested in dominating the other, what eventually happens is you begin to think of those people as human animals. And if you listen to the rhetoric in Israel about the Palestinians, there are many Israeli leaders, and of course people in the wider public, who think the Palestinians are animals. And if you think that human beings are animals, it's easy to justify murdering them. By the way, this is exactly what the Nazis did with regard to the Jews during the Holocaust. As far as the Nazis were concerned, as far as the killers were concerned, the Jews were subhuman. They were animals. And killing them, therefore, was not that big a deal. And what you have in the case of Israel and the Palestinians is an apartheid state where one group is bent on dominating the other group in really horrible ways. And to justify that to yourself, you end up describing the Palestinians as animals, as subhuman. And that makes it easy to talk about starving them to death, especially after the events of October 7th. When you go into October 7th thinking that you're dealing with subhumans, and then October 7th happens, it doesn't take much imagination to realize you're soon going to be in a situation where lots of Israelis want to wreak death and destruction on all of the Palestinians in Gaza. And that's where we are. And again, getting back to our earlier discussion, you would hope that the United States and the Europeans would go to some lengths. In my opinion, you would hope they would go to great lengths to not let the Israelis act on their worst impulses vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But not only did that not happen, we've basically helped the Israelis. We're complicitous in this genocide. I've said it on numerous occasions in public forums. The United States is complicitous in this genocide, and we will pay a reputational price for that. And that is certainly all for the good.
Right. So another question from one of our participants states that Israel's actions in Palestine and Gaza is perhaps the most ever thoroughly documented genocide. And how do you see this affecting global anti-Semitism?
Yeah, okay, hang on. I think there's no question that this is the most thoroughly documented genocide in history. And it's in large part because of the internet. You know, the Israel lobby in the United States is deeply interested in shutting down TikTok. And the reason that the lobby wants to shut down TikTok is that there are all of these videos of what the Israelis are doing that are circulating on TikTok. And anybody with a moral compass who sees these videos is appalled by what the Israelis are doing. I might add to that, it's really quite amazing the extent to which the Israelis themselves are providing hard evidence of the horrors that they're committing in Gaza. Israeli soldiers are taking selfies and taking pictures, making videos of what they're doing to humiliate, if not kill, Palestinians, and then posting them on social media, which then get posted on TikTok and on other platforms. Furthermore, if you look at what Israeli elites were saying after October 7th, they were providing all sorts of evidence of genocidal intent. I like to emphasize that Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, ran a story right before the hearings at the International Court of Justice that South Africa generated by bringing charges of a potential genocide against the Palestinians by Israel. Just before that court hearing, Haaretz ran a headline that said, "The path to The Hague," and of course, The Hague is where the trial was being held. "The path to The Hague is paved with the comments of Israel's leaders." In other words, Israeli leaders were saying such horrible things about what they wanted to do in Gaza that it provided evidence of genocidal intent. And again, you have all this evidence of the selfies. Really quite amazing. So it is a thoroughly documented genocide, in my opinion. Now, your other question was, what does this do in terms of global anti-Semitism? Just one quick definitional point. Anybody who criticizes Israel in the West is called an anti-Semite. If you say that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is an example of mass murder, you were to say that, you didn't use the genocide word, you said the Israelis were committing mass murder, you would be called an anti-Semite. Steve and I have been called anti-Semites since 2006 at time after time, as you can imagine. Anybody who listens to this broadcast, I shouldn't say anybody, lots of people who are pro-Israel who listen to this broadcast and hear what I have to say would describe me as an anti-Semite. This is ridiculous. I'm not an anti-Semite, and you wouldn't be an anti-Semite if you accused Israel of mass murder in Gaza. You'd be stating a simple fact. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, it's just important we understand we're talking about real anti-Semitism. We're talking about hatred of Jews, wanting to do horrible things to Jews because they are Jews, okay? I do worry that this is going to lead to a significant rise in global anti-Semitism. I think that this would be regrettable in the extreme, but I think we're in a situation where there is so much anger around the world at what the Israelis are doing that it's easy to imagine how some of that anger becomes truly anti-Semitic in nature. And I think that this is, horrible. But again, it gets back to the basic point that I've made to you, that Israeli policy is not good for the United States. It's not good for Israel. And what we're now saying is not good for Jews around the world, Jews in the diaspora. And I think that that's true. And I think it's regrettable, but those who have tried to contest the lobby in the past and have made that point, like me and Steve Walt, have not been able to influence policy. And that's why we're in such a mess today.
Right. And so in another broadcast, I believe on a podcast at the University of Chicago, you talked about how the issue of Israel, basically, the US commitment in Israel, is taking up valuable resources that would be much more efficiently used elsewhere, especially in Southeast Asia. And one of our participants asked a question related to that. So the question is as follows. With the world tensions on the rise, signs pointing to increased arms activity and alliance formations in Southeast Asia, how do you anticipate these developments influencing the United States foreign policy towards Israel? And there's a follow-up question which says that will such circumstances potentially prompt the United States to reconsider its priorities, possibly resulting in Israel and the broader region being moved down the priority list?
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me just start by saying the United States cares greatly about three areas of the world. We care about East Asia, and we care about East Asia because that's where China is located. We care about Europe because that's where other great powers are located. Russia is located in Europe. And we care about the Persian Gulf. We care about the Persian Gulf because that's where the oil is. You notice I didn't say we care about the Middle East. I said we care about the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf matters. The rest of the Middle East doesn't matter very much at all, in my opinion. Matters a bit, but the three areas of the world where we should be willing to fight and die are East Asia, Europe, and the Persian Gulf, okay? If you look at the situation we're in today, the area of the world that should matter the most to us is East Asia, because China is a peer competitor. And it is powerful enough that it has the potential, or it certainly will have the potential in all likelihood moving forward, to dominate all of East Asia. And we don't want that, right? So the number one area of the world for the United States is East Asia. Europe is not terribly important because Russia is not a great threat. But we are bogged down in the Ukraine war. We're doing everything in Ukraine but pulling the triggers and pushing the buttons. We do have limited numbers of troops on the ground, and we are deeply committed to the Ukrainians. We are almost at war with Russia. You could say we're effectively at war with Russia. I don't want to get into a debate about words, but we are deeply involved. Foolishly, I might add, and you folks all know that I think our commitment is foolish. But the key point you want to understand is we are bogged down in the Ukraine war in Europe, and now we are bogged down in the Middle East with the Israelis. This gets back to where we started our discussion. The United States does not want this war to escalate. Why? Because the most important area of the world for us is not the Middle East. It's not the Persian Gulf. The most important area of the world for us is East Asia. That's why we talked about pivoting to Asia. We want to be able to pivot to Asia. That means we don't want to be deeply involved in Europe, and we don't want to be deeply involved in the Middle East. But the Israelis threaten to get us more deeply involved than we already are. And we're already too deeply involved in the Middle East. So you want to think about the question of what happens if a crisis breaks out next week in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China over this shoal in the Paracel Islands, or it's actually the Spratly Islands, that the Filipinos and the Chinese are at odds over. Okay, what happens if a conflict breaks out and we get dragged in, right? That's going to be very difficult for us to handle because we're already deeply involved in Europe and in the greater Middle East, right? So it is in our interest to put an end to the war in Ukraine, to make sure there's no escalation in the Middle East, and that the war in Gaza ends sooner rather than later. Right? You can see where I'm going here. But the fact is, we're getting more deeply involved in the Middle East. There's no evidence we're getting out of Ukraine. There's evidence that Ukraine is in deep trouble and is actually going to lose to Russia, which is not good for the United States. There's all sorts of evidence that the Israelis are going to lose in Gaza and that people are going to come to recognize that this conflict between Iran and Israel was not in Israel's interest and it lost. And therefore, the United States is going to have egg on its face in both Ukraine and in the Middle East. And again, where is the area of the world that we should care the most about? It's East Asia. But we can't really focus on East Asia. So your question is, does that mean the United States will reduce its commitment to Israel and reduce its interest in the Middle East or Persian Gulf, however you want to put it? And the answer is no. And the answer is no because of the power of the lobby. The United States cannot cut Israel loose. The United States cannot walk away from the Middle East. It certainly can't walk away from the Persian Gulf. If there's any area where we will reduce our presence, reduce our interest, it is in Europe, and it will apply to the Ukraine war. And by the way, you already see this happening. If you think about it, the United States cannot get a $61 billion package of aid for Ukraine through Congress. It has been unable to get that $61 billion package through Congress. It is having no trouble getting aid to Israel, and it will have no trouble getting aid to Israel moving forward for one simple reason, which is the topic of our discussion today, the lobby. So if there's any diminishment in America's commitment to any area of the world, it will be Europe, not the greater Middle East, right? And it certainly won't be East Asia, because that's where China is, and China is the peer competitor.
Professor Mearsheimer, you've been very generous with your time. I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for allocating your time to us. And I think all of us at Bilkent University have been really pleased with your insightful remarks, and we would love to see you perhaps at another time in another discussion and host you, perhaps in physical form at the university if possible. That would be amazing. But thank you very much for being with us today. It was a real pleasure, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed myself thoroughly, and I wish I could have done it in person, but unfortunately, getting to Ankara quickly is not easy these days. And
Right.
but it's good that we have Zoom, and I
Yes.
look forward to doing it again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You too.
Yeah. Have a good day.